Thank you so much for those really beautiful comments. I'm profusely grateful to Jelka and the members of the Luciano Tomassini Latin American International Relations Book Award, not least for your labor and care in reviewing so many excellent books. And it's truly an honor beyond words to receive this recognition. When my publisher, UC Press, asked me what my vision of success would be for this book, I gave them an answer that I'm sure disappointed the marketing team. I didn't mention sales. I said I would love for this book to be respected by the communities whose histories it explores, and that I would love for the book to be respected by the thinkers that I respect. And in my head, I conjured this committee as I wrote that line. So thank you for that profound affirmation, and thank you to UC Press for supporting my modest ambitions. So I also want to thank the LASA team, and in particular Gisela Blanco, for facilitating this conversation here today. She's done so much work. So today I'll be talking about two islands in the so-called Dutch Caribbean, and I say so-called because that term recognizes the shared history of Dutch colonization, but it flattens the cultural and linguistic diversity of the islands that often fall under this umbrella. And arguably, these islands are a marginalized part of an already marginalized region. Being Dutch and Papiamentu speaking, they often fall outside of the kind of hegemonic linguistic categories that for some define Latin America. So it's exceedingly meaningful for me to see a book about Aruba and Curacao recognized in the field of Latin American studies. And this is why, from my earliest days in graduate school, LASA was the first conference I attended as a grad student. And that's why I've always found this to be such a capacious and welcoming intellectual space. I'd certainly be remiss not to acknowledge my debt to Caribbeanist scholars working in Aruba and Curacao, as well as many archivists, librarians, and activists there and in the Netherlands who edified my thinking on so many of the issues described in this book. So if you read one part of my book, let it be the bibliography, please. It's a love, and the footnotes, it's a love letter to those individuals. And finally, I want to thank Mary Roldan for being here today. When you sign up to be a mentor in graduate school, it's a job for life. So thank you, Mary.
But a delightful one.
I hope so. Mary has been nurturing this project. I almost said suffering with this project, but nurturing this project since it began as a dissertation at the CUNY Graduate Center, and her interventions were vital in making this book more international and transnational in its reach, and so I'm very confident that I wouldn't be up here today without you, so thank you for being here. It's really beautiful that you can join us. So I'm going to try to be brief in introducing you to my book and the contributions that I hope it makes, but first I'd like to set the scene with an image, and perhaps this image is familiar to some of you. It's a postcard of a massive oil refinery perched atop a tropical beach on the island of Aruba. So in this picture that you see here, distillation towers and gas flares loom over white sand beaches. And for many people, this image comes as something of a surprise, if not an eyesore. Many audiences outside of the region typically don't associate the Caribbean with the age of oil. Seldom does it come to mind when we imagine the world as it was transformed by fossil fuels. But in the 1940s, this refinery, known as the Lago Refinery, which was owned by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, was actually the largest oil company, it was the largest refinery in terms of daily throughput in the world. And indeed, on the neighboring island of Curacao, which was also a Dutch colony, the Royal Dutch Shell Group established what at the time was their largest plant in the Western Hemisphere. So, I mean, these refineries, I can go on and on about the importance, but one fact that often astounds people is that during World War II, both of these refineries supplied over 80% of the Allies' aviation fuel, literally liberating Europe from fascism. So though this history is little known outside of the region, it's an inescapable fact on the islands themselves, and the vast majority of people there have deep, multi-generational ties to these enterprises. So my book, Offshore Attachments, is an attempt to restore the history of Aruba and Curacao to the history of oil and fossil fueled capitalism. It charts how the building of an oil economy relied upon contested interventions into race and sexuality from the opening of the refineries in the early 20th century to their sale or their shuttering in the 1980s. And this story, I hope, helps us to rethink the categories of difference that are embedded in the fossil economy and the labor that was ultimately required to transform oil into wealth. So perhaps, for instance, you've heard oil described as liquid gold or black gold, making it seem as though oil just comes out of the ground with immediate value. But that's not the case. As my book argues, oil could not be commodified into fuel for cars or railroads or airplanes or fertilizer or makeup, for instance, without the work of people. And in the Caribbean, the sustenance of that workforce relied upon sexual and reproductive labor, as well as intimate practices that were thought to encourage hard work and industrial discipline. And these interventions were always tied to the making and management of race itself. So we could say that intimacy subsidized a massive industrial experiment in the Caribbean that had consequences for the world as a whole, leading to the profusion of petroleum products into virtually all aspects of our daily lives. Now, backing up though, one fundamental contribution of this research is to show that oil has a significant Caribbean history. Frequently, within Caribbeanist scholarship, it often seems as if the importance of the Caribbean to the modern world system stops at the plantation, at the devastating systems of racialized labor management that inaugurated uneven global integration. And today, most scholars working in the Caribbean accept that the plantation inaugurated capitalist modernity. And perhaps as a consequence of this, we know a lot more about the plantation than we do about that other paradigmatic site of modernity in the Caribbean, which is the oil refinery. But it was here, in the refinery, that oil, which is a material of limited use in its crude state, it was here that oil was distilled into an array of petroleum and petrochemical products. So if the plantation served as the locus of capitalism's growth in the first instance, it's my contention that the Caribbean oil refinery would be no less vital to its seemingly limitless expansion in the 20th century. Now, we all know that corporate managers like to be very hyperbolic about their own importance, but in this case, I think this Standard Oil produced map is actually correct about Aruba's role in the world of oil. Caribbean refineries produced motor gasoline, everything from motor gasoline to aviation fuel, all of which enabled the collapsing of time and space upon which capitalism relies, and in effect, producing the very cartographic imagination that you see represented here. When I asked ExxonMobil for permission to use this map, which they graciously agreed, in the email signature of the person responding, it said, "Think about the planet before you print this email." So I thought that was funny. Okay, so just to give you a little bit better orientation, Aruba and Curacao are located in the southern Caribbean, just about 30 miles north of the oil-rich Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. Which sometimes, you can see through to Venezuela on a clear day. And so this is largely where crude was coming from. Crude was being run from Maracaibo to Aruba and Curacao multiple times a day. Okay, so in recent years, energy humanities scholars have insisted that fossil fuels don't simply enable transnational transport or shape geopolitics. They also trickle down, so to speak. They shape and saturate our deeply raced, classed, and gendered notions of what it means to live a good life. And this happens in ways that we often struggle to recognize because of the ubiquity of oil in our daily lives, from the makeup that I'm wearing to my vinyl-sided house back in suburban California. So my book joins histories of energy and sexuality to reveal that sexual energy was entangled in the production of energy itself. As the industry boomed in the first half of the 20th century, oil's commodification relied upon intimate labor and care work, and numerous examples populate the book, which Jelka shared, from corporate efforts to domesticate Aruban and Curaçaoan men as a method for managing labor, to state-regulated sex work that was designed to cater to and sustain a largely migrant workforce. And likewise, as the industry declined, numerous interventions were sought in the bedroom, such as trying to limit the fertility, especially of low-income women of color. as job opportunities shrank. But the sites of intimacy that were deemed pertinent to the oil economy included not just the regulation of sex, they also involved the remaking of sensibilities. I think I need to go back. So in these oil towns, Arubans and Curaçaoans were everywhere enticed to assert patriarchal authority. This was a sensibility that was thought to enhance performance and discipline on the job. So you're looking at one example, which is a Shell employee publication from 1947 extolling the virtues of responsibility. Responsibility meaning duty to the nuclear family and one's legal kin. And you needed to sort of emulate that model of family formation in order to advance in the industry. And petroleum products were also thought to encourage new domestic arrangements and forms of gendered expression beyond the refinery gates. So the yearning for cars, refrigerators, new kinds of household appliances that were gasified or electrified were all thought to encourage acquisitiveness and thrift and hard work. These were values that were imagined as antidotes to the inheritance of racial slavery and colonialism. But just as importantly, intimacy was not only a site of control, it was also a site of struggle, one that involved not only elites, but also the production workers, housewives, sex workers, domestic workers, and other men and women orbiting the industry. So quite crucially, the demands of Caribbean people to control their own romantic lives could transform the industry from the ground up. And people made these arguments from a range of moral positions. In the 1950s, you see them in the bottom right-hand corner here, middle-class Aruban housewives who were married to men in the industry embraced the very same discourses of domesticity and paternalism that were promoted by oil companies, while in the 1960s, a later generation, who you see at the top there, would reject intimate meddling by corporate and state actors, and instead they demanded erotic liberation as a component of freedom from capitalist and colonial interests. Now, finally, and here is where international relations comes into play. Interferences into Caribbean intimate life often relied upon the stretching or usurping of law. This occurred first under Dutch colonial governance, and then after 1954, under a democratically elected government that operated under Dutch sovereignty. So to this very day, Aruba and Curaçao remain under Dutch sovereignty. They're integrated unevenly into the European Netherlands. And on a very fundamental level, this fragmented sovereignty proved essential to oil corporations. The lingering attachment to the Netherlands seemed to guarantee a certain stability for foreign investment, making it safe to pour lots of money into the construction of plants. And at the same time, the ambiguous incorporation of Caribbean islands into European legal regimes also enabled numerous profitable loopholes, whether the granting of generous tax exemptions and tax holidays to lax labor and environmental regulations. So these are all hallmarks of what scholars call the offshore economy. And as anthropologists and geographers have said before me, despite that kind of seductive spatial metaphor of the offshore is not at all removed from the onshore. Rather, global capitalism relies upon these zones of apparent legal exceptionality in order to grow. And my book argues that oil companies and their state protectors didn't just rely on these kind of offshore legal mechanisms for things like regulating taxes and labor. They also broke statutes pertaining to extremely intimate terrains, including the regulation of family, reproduction, and sex. And so we could say that sex itself was offshored in the creation of a new global energy system. And I track that process from the boom in the early 20th century to the bust in the 1980s. And so this framework of the offshore allowed me to account for multiple vectors of power that inflected Caribbean societies. The book elaborates on the framework of the offshore as a method for doing international history. And oftentimes, the study of empire is approached as a kind of two-way street between metropole and colony, with the transnational being figured as this already existing or self-evident unit of analysis. But I found the concept of the offshore useful to think with because it offered me a way to account for not just the enduring links between metropole and colony, but also the kind of roving transnational interests of global fossil capital, and also the specificities of race and sex in Caribbean societies, where these global processes don't just wash away all that had come before, as is sometimes posited by theories of globalization. So this allowed me a way to account for dominant actors while still allowing us to see how these forces condense in really particular sites and in intimate terrains. So I'm going to leave you with that bird's eye view of the book, and I'll look forward to your comments and questions. And while I did say sales are not of huge interest to me, if you liked what you heard, UC Press is offering a 40% discount through the conference.
And it's worth it. It's totally worth it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure, actually, and privilege, despite the fact that I am not a morning person, to be here and not only support but celebrate Chelsea's extraordinary accomplishment. I'm going to do a little parenthesis of sort of personal reflection, which was Chelsea joined my, the first historiographical literature seminar, which is obligatory for those who do Latin America as their major field at the Graduate Center, in the same class as Mila Burns, who is here as well. And it was an extraordinary class, really, of just incredible engagement and discussion. And there were students who brought such extraordinary and differing perspectives and background, because Chelsea was not doing Latin American history. She was doing European and the Dutch Caribbean. And I feel very proud of the fact that we converted her. I don't normally ascribe to conversion, but it was just a wonderful experience of sort of seeing all of these various connections that, as Chelsea explains them in the book, become incredibly apparent, and we think to ourselves, wow, why didn't I see that before? Of course, the Dutch Caribbean is absolutely integrated and part of the Latin American story and part of a much larger transnational story of global exchanges and interactions that go back to the colonial period. But while we recognize those for the colonial period, and there's been an enormous amount of work, for instance, beginning to think about the Atlantic economies, beginning to think about the connections between Africa, Europe, the Americas, and the centrality, for instance, and I'll just use this example, of the products of other extractive industries like gold and silver in places like Mexico, Colombia, the Caribbean islands, and Peru, in shaping global capitalism, right? The fact that we could find, for instance, silver pesetas in China by the 16th century. But for some reason, there's a sort of arbitrary distinction that seems to be made in the historiography in which it falls out. And in the modern period, particularly the 20th century and the late 19th century, from the late 19th century through the 20th century, we cease to see the very critical, both labor, capital flows, interactions between the Dutch, what we are calling here the Dutch Caribbean or the French Caribbean or the British Caribbean, and the larger kind of transnational field, specifically with Latin America. And this is particularly curious in the case of Aruba and Curaçao, because, and here I'm going to reflect on what these places meant to me as the child of Colombians and who visited Colombia all through the summers when, as they were growing up, and would hear of tales of, oh, I'm going to Curaçao, to the duty-free shops, right? In my mind, I never associated it with something like oil. Curaçao and Aruba were places that you went for a vacation, or you went to take advantage of the fact that you could get these products that at the time, now you can get anything you want in Colombia, but in those years before neoliberalism and kind of economic aperture, you would go to Panama, you would go to Curaçao to buy all those electrodomestics and other goods, perfumes, et cetera, that you couldn't get, or you could only get at extraordinary prices here in Colombia. But I never associated it with the importance of the development of oil. The fact that Chelsea gives us of being the largest refinery and of the extraordinary impact that it had during the Second World War is kind of mind-blowing. It's not something that we associate, and as she showed in that postcard, which I think is very telling, it's there in the background as it disappeared, but it's now this hulking mass that continues to have long-standing repercussions in this particular area. So because we have a series of questions that we kind of came together, put together that I think will make it really interesting for us to be able to explore the very rich aspects of this book. I'm just going to make a couple of comments here in terms, and Chelsea has done a lovely job also telling us about the sort of substance of the book. And one of the most important features of this book, I think, is how Chelsea tells us, and at first we can say, oh, yeah, and then she really kind of unpacks it. Oil is not just a commodity, right? It's embedded. It permeates every aspect of 20th century consumer and industrial life in all kinds of ways, including those little microplastics that we now know are totally embedded in our human bodily systems. It is everywhere in ways that we don't even question and that we totally take for granted. But it also has extraordinary conceptual, cultural, real human kind of impacts that we also don't consider. So by taking oil, I think that one of the kind of astonishing features of this particular study is that she manages to then build out all of these little avenues of exploration that take into account, for instance, sexuality, domesticity, the construction of orders of respectability, for instance, legislation, which plays a very important role, actually, in this particular book, without being boring. I want to stress that. It's really interesting, but it makes a difference to look at how the ways in which legal systems that are developed in one place are constantly violated or reconfigured in order to be able to advance capitalism and the interests of these corporate entities in other places that seem to be offshore. And we're going to talk a lot about offshore, I think, because it's such an interesting concept that is developed in this book. And it isn't just a geographical place, but also a whole set of relationships that in significant ways have defined and impacted the histories, not just of the Dutch Caribbean, but of other parts of Latin America. And I'm going to create a little bit of a comparison, I think, with the Colombian case, if that's okay. The second thing that is really amazing about this book is how she explores the racialized construction of labor, as she puts it so well, and says, quote, grafted onto existing colonial prejudices. And here, one of the most amazing aspects of this book is the before and after lives of colonialism. And what I mean by that is the ways in which, and it's not unique to the Dutch, I kept thinking about the ways in which, for instance, US companies also in the sugar industry, in other industries in places like Cuba and other parts of Latin America, would translate and transfer expectations and beliefs and assumptions around race, around sexuality, around respectability or the lack of it, from the South, for instance, in the United States, to the ways in which they operated and created camps or working environments in other parts of the world. But the Dutch do this in an extraordinary way. I hope I'm not offending you.
Not at all.
It's pretty amazing. And they basically, you see the ways in which their experiences in other parts of the world, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's in Suriname, whether any of the other colonies or colonial possessions in which they have operated, all form this kind of mass of information and a toolkit, a set of toolkits that they then are able to draw from and apply in contexts that are completely different, at least on the surface. Racialized orders, for instance, for labor, hierarchies, notions of respectability. I kept thinking of Anne Laura Stoller's work, for instance, which is very relevant in this context of thinking about the ways in which distinctions are made between, and the extraordinary efforts that are made to impede the possibility of the emergence of what she calls a métis population, right, of mixed blood. In islands that are inherently mixed. That is the very nature, right, of the colonial encounter, if you will. It's impossible to create these kinds of categories of purity, and the very people who impose them or set them up were themselves constantly violating them. That's one of the features that I think is so interesting about this book, that it explores, I guess hypocrisy is one way to put it, of elites who themselves are having extramarital relationships and proliferation of children that emerge from those relationships and may themselves also be, frequenting the brothels that they create, et cetera, and yet at the same time are setting up these very draconian, in many cases, and highly regulated systems that say that the rest of the population is not adhering to certain levels of morality or respectability and have to be vigilantly surveyed and constantly regulated in order for our society to be able to function and survive. So that aspect itself, I think, also translates and helps us think about these kinds of situations in other parts of the globe. It's not limited to this particular case. Although I will say, and I shared this with Chelsea yesterday, that after reading the ways in which the migratory flows of sex workers, for instance, from Colombia, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, because there was this perception, which seems totally ill-based, if I can say, that somehow light-skinned women were going to be more sexually attractive to these workers, and therefore it necessitated having this constant flow to be able to satisfy the sexual urges and maintain a kind of labor stability, if you will, in both Curaçao and Urabá, but particularly in Aruba, but particularly in Curaçao, that it required these sex workers to travel from these places, and it was every 2 weeks to a month was the limit of their stay. And then they would have to leave, and a new set of sex workers would arrive. It's kind of astonishing when you think about what the logistics are of organizing something like that. But then going even further to regulating their access to abortion, to birth control, to whether they can have children. The expectation is if you're engaging in all of that sex, at some point you may have some children, right? And yet these women are subjected to an extraordinary array of surveillance mechanisms of control, leading to, in one case, Curaçao, which is just kind of blew my mind, the creation of the world's biggest open-air brothel, Campo Alegre. I can't even tell you how I couldn't wrap my mind around that you would just have these fields where literally you were using them so that they could become an open-air brothel. And it's done from the perspective, and this isn't unique to the Dutch, or to the Americans or to anyone else, in which all of those sort of structures of morality, godliness, the importance of religious values, et cetera, are constantly violated and undermined and in fact rethought in order to be able to enable this system that is going to give rise to corporate profits. It's one of the most important contributions, I think, that Chelsea's book makes. And I just want, so we can get to the questions, because I want to make sure that we have time to do that. For me, this treatment of the women really kind of, when Chelsea started this project as a dissertation, gender and sexuality were much more front and center than the extractive oil industry. And they continue to be front and center, but now are empowered by, I think, the very fine-grained and thoughtfully explored ways in which the regulation of sexuality and intimacy, as she calls it, because it isn't just the provision of these domestic sex workers, to these areas, but it's also the ways in which the domesticity and intimacy of families on the island was regulated so that they could kind of aspire to and achieve a middle-class kind of respectability that was absolutely linked to their obedience and observance of certain kinds of social norms about marriage, about the ways in which they organized their households, about living conditions, about not making radical protests or engaging in any kind of agitation that might, in some ways, disturb the stability. But it's the way in which for those of us who have looked at the extractive industries, and I have in the context of violence, for instance, we very rarely take seriously or into account the dimensions of sexuality, for instance, and gender in those. And here, just a little parentheses, for those of you who haven't gone, and I highly recommend it, El Museo de Oro is fantastic, but they have an exhibit right now in the basement, which is about the Amazon. And one of the things, I went to it before, about 5 days before this conference, but it occurred to me that it was very relevant, for instance, in the context of discussing Chelsea's book. At one point, after looking at colonization from outside, for instance, the emergence of extractive industries, the development of coca, which had always existed in this area, but now for the purposes of transforming it into something like cocaine, the violence, the armed groups, the kinds of disruption of society that occurs there, there was this fantastic and very moving and kind of heartbreaking quote by members of an indigenous community in which they essentially said, all of the ills, prostitution, alcoholism, the violation of social and community norms, the undermining, and whatever we may, as non-Indigenous people, think of the ways in which gender is treated within these communities, it was very much a notion that it followed certain rules, certain rituals, and all of those were disrupted. And the ecological and environmental impact, the destruction of sort of landscapes and communities. It was this long list, and in the end it said, and it is up to the Indigenous communities to have to heal this, and it's going to take us a long time. And I thought about that in the context of Curaçao and Aruba, that the oil industry has a boom period, and over 20 to 30 years, it has extraordinary effects, and we could think, okay, and then it ends, and it's over. It's not over. It, of course, leaves not only the detritus of all of that pollution and the ways it has transformed the environment, but it has also, because of the extraordinary power that it exerted over these societies, fundamentally transformed the landscape and fundamentally transformed people's mental conceptions, right? Their emotional attachments. It's a very good title, Offshore Attachments, honestly. And the ways in which they not only see each other, but also and sometimes in positive ways, the way it also mobilized them, for instance, to take action, to form political parties, for housewives to mobilize and lead massive protests, for instance, the last thing you might have anticipated. So it can have indirectly these kinds of positive effects of really forcing people, in a sense, to say, I'm going to have to stand up for myself, and I'm going to counteract these ideas that I refuse, that are negatively affecting my life, the life of my community, of my nation. And that can be something we can rescue as a positive aspect, if you will, out of this. But the long-term aspects are ones that keep reverberating forever and ever, because even after the oil industry stops functioning, that sex tourism doesn't stop. Labor migrations don't stop. The pain in the hierarchization, if you will, of labor and of society doesn't stop. It's now become embedded in these societies. And we see the ways in which Curaçao and Aruba, interestingly enough, become, I think, and you use the word mirror, I would say absolutely kind of touchstones for thinking about and questioning the impact of these processes in other places that we never think of as being like the Caribbean. I'm thinking, for instance, of Rust Belt areas in the United States. After, for instance, steel is no longer the case, or Ford isn't the company that could provide jobs that, provided the possibilities of access to a kind of middle-class aspiration of respectability and consumer life. The ways in which, for instance, in multiple other areas of the world, once one big economic kind of behemoth leaves, it leaves people scrambling because it's already created a kind of sense of what the good life, I know, in parentheses, but still in quotation marks, what the good life might be, and now you've created those desires, you've instilled those expectations, and there is no way of actually satisfying them. Actually, I think we can relate this totally to what we're experiencing in the United States in many areas today. So this isn't something that's limited to a backward or formerly colonial or a third world country. It is very real of late century, early 21st century and late 20th century capitalism, where we see that. Okay, I want to finish with one little thing, and that was the ways in which this made me reflect on the impact of companies like Shell and Standard Oil or Texaco or Esso in the context of Colombia. And I've studied it very much in the context of sort of violence, for instance, where you have the Shell oil camp, for instance, which was located in Puerto del Rio in the state of Antioquia, right on the Magdalena River, and the Magdalena is the river that basically traverses and has historically been the kind of major artery within Colombian society. It was where the Shell oil camp was established in the 1940s. And when the liberal populist leader Gaitán was assassinated in 1948, I was telling Chelsea this, the workers at the Shell oil camp took it over for 10 days. And 10 days is an astonishingly long period of time in which the state was unable to reassert control over the camp. and the realities of the power that both the company, but also its radicalized workers, who after years of sort of agitating for better conditions, experiencing exactly the kind of racialized and hierarchical imposition of order that was true in Curaçao and Aruba, because most of the workers in the Magdalena Medio were actually people of African descent who had migrated from the Caribbean coast in Colombia. It wasn't primarily people, there were some from the region, but it was a sparsely populated region really until the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so these were people who had migrated specifically to work in the big gold mines, for instance, Frontino Gold Company, or in Shell, or in any of the other sort of incipient extractive industries that emerged. And around those, that created an economy too, of local cattle ranching, of food supply, of brothels, of establishments providing alcohol. In one of the, when I was doing the study, I sort of analyzed, for instance, the consumption of alcohol and beef in these areas. And in the Colombian context, alcohol was a monopoly. And so each region, and it produced almost all of the revenue that was used for things. It's sort of inherently ironic and paradoxical, but it produced the revenue that was used to pay for education and public health as well. And it was very profitable. And although the central authorities, and by this I mean both the national but particularly the regional authorities, historically viewed the Shell oil camp as a kind of necessary evil because they needed the gasoline to be able to fuel the cars, and also industry, which was located in a place like Medellin, they also viewed it with distrust. It was a Protestant company. It was a company that was, particularly as a kind of sense of nationalism began to emerge in the 1940s and 1950s, a company that inherently was like having an enemy on national territory. They were accused of smuggling things out, of violating the laws, of essentially representing a kind of foreign power on national soil. And one of the aspects of this particular area is that really reminded me and resonated with what was happening in Aruba and Curaçao was the ways in which the presence of this company fundamentally transformed local politics. Mm-hmm. So the only way, for instance, in which these workers could get the attention of the national government was, in fact, to become quite radical and to embrace their identity as being sexually promiscuous, deviant, radical, willing to take up arms, for instance, to contest the state. It's a kind of interesting thing, right? That in a way provided them with some small protections in the sense that the state recognized its limitations in being able to absolutely control those areas. So even though they wanted to send, and they would send, army or police to try to put it down, in fact, you can't maintain a permanent military presence in these areas. And so what is much more effective, and I think this is what Chelsea's study also shows, is those, sometimes not so subtle, but complex systems of cultural and racialized and sexual systems of control and belief that continue to operate and to, in some ways, shape the way different sectors of society who have now been sometimes pitted against each other limit their reactions to the state. So for instance, for those middle-class workers or who had received, for instance, some housing, some benefits, saw themselves of achieving a kind of middle-class life in a place like Aruba, they didn't see themselves as being on the same, in the same situation, for instance, as predominantly black workers in Curaçao. For those sex workers and for the rough, sort of the wildcatters and the migratory flows, which are not just of labor from the Black or British Caribbean, but also of US workers, for instance, of European workers to these areas. They don't see themselves in any way as sharing anything with this other category of individuals who they look down upon, even though they share the same constrained and difficult labor and physical relationships. And so it's the enduring power of these racialized, hierarchical, gendered systems that, in a sense, is what guarantees the longstanding effects of what I'm going to call colonialism, right? even when it's not possible for states to actually physically contain or repress or kind of do away with this kind of, with the conditions that emerge either of labor radicalism or of protest or of, in these particular areas. But these other systems continue to operate in a very powerful way and continue to shape these societies in the long term. So I'm going to leave it there so that we can have an opportunity to be able to have questions, because, okay.
Great, fantastic. So there is some time for some discussion, questions. Paulo.
Informing debates within the Netherlands about reckoning with kind of imperial pasts. My sense is that, in contrast certainly to Britain, there's a very kind of timid reckoning in the Netherlands, and so that, you know, at best a naive and at worst a hypocritical narrative still predominates about Dutch imperialism. And here, in a sense, you've got also a story that kind of merges with Dutch global capitalist practices, right? So, although, you know, we're all very grateful that you've been turned into a Latin American, I'm curious about how you see this book intervening within the Dutch academic context. Because it seems to me that, you know, it can have a very important effect in moving discussions in a more productive direction.
Thank you for that question. Should I start with one, or should we collect more? Or?
Yeah, let's collect more.
Okay,
Cynthia, and then
great.
in the back. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you. I have sort of a question for Chelsea and maybe a question for the rest of us, an open one. For Chelsea, it's related to what Paulo just said. What's your next project, or what are you working on now? I'm dying to hear. But for those of us who work on extractive industry issues and are not historians, you say it's over, oil is over. The actual industrial processing of oil is over in these areas, but it's still going on in Venezuela. It's probably going to boom in Guyana. Brazil has now said, Lula has said that they're going to continue to pump the oil until it's gone. So in the region, we still have, despite the global discussion of energy transition, we're going to keep pumping it for a long time. And sort of what can we learn from this to help us in our research on contemporary challenges with extraction? So that's sort of an open question.
Yeah. Super, thank you. And two questions in the back. Yeah.
Hello. So my question is whether you have examined the impact on individual communities, because like in case of India, primarily at the first stage, only men were immigrated to those colonies. Then, understanding the necessity, women were also allowed. And as compared to other communities, perhaps the Indian community was much more close, because the newer generation, probably women getting carried away by Caribbean men, and that impacting the Indian families, and probably Indian families having a perception that Caribbean men, because of the skin color, were inferior, as if Indians were light-skinned or something like that. So did you examine the manner in which it actually impacted different communities? Because not each and every community would have perceived intimacy and interracial intimacy in the same manner.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to ask Chelsea a bit about your research methods, how many archives, how was the process to do your field work to elaborate this text? Yeah.
Thank you. Wow. That will give
This
you
was
enough.
like, it's as though I
Unfortunately,
planted
it's
all
some of the
these.
questions that I was going to ask you, so that's great.
I could not be more grateful for these questions. You all have hit on things that I was hoping people would ask me. So, Paolo, to your question about how does this study intervene in debates about colonial histories in the Netherlands, I mean, I'd start with a bit of a personal anecdote, which is that I moved to the Netherlands as a teenager, just as I was becoming politicized through the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and thinking about, participating in those protests and waking up to the horrific history of the United States as an empire. And so my high school sent me on an exchange program to the Netherlands, and I had really only received this narrative that the feminist scholar Gloria Wekker terms white innocence, of Dutch society as this liberal, just, ethical nation that is, a guiding light to other nations in the world. And I arrived and found that I had effectively traded one empire for another. And yet, when you try to broach questions about racism, about colonial histories, you were met with this vociferous denial that existed. And that was one of the many things that sort of, catapulted me into this study. So I hope that it intervenes very much in debates about the colonial histories of the Netherlands, which have focused overwhelmingly on Indonesia. In the last 15 years, I would say, we've seen a growth of excellent studies of the Caribbean that have shown the endurance of Dutch Empire in these sites. But as I mentioned very briefly in my talk, I think that story is hugely important and we have to grapple with it. But when I immersed myself in the sources, I realized that metropole colony framework, which had characterized so much of the scholarship that I valued, failed to capture the complexity of what was going on. So we needed to see how oil companies operated through states, through these kind of fragmented and variegated forms of sovereignty, but they aren't themselves states. And actually on the terrain of sexuality is where you can really disaggregate in the company and the colony, or the colonial state, and see some of their differences, while of course they're extremely imbricated and rely on each other in complex ways. So I hope that, in the history of sexuality, as you know, there's often this discourse of fashioning sexualized and racialized others for the sake of cohering the nation. And so in the Netherlands, a lot of scholarship has looked at how did colonialism contribute to a kind of bourgeois, liberal Dutch subjecthood that came from the colonies back to Europe. That is extremely important, but there's also a political economic dimension of this. So I really wanted to bring the history of sexuality into conversation with political economy, and I hope that makes a contribution to these conversations in Dutch historiography. Cynthia, thank you for your interest in my next project. I am currently working on a history of electrification in the Caribbean from the late 19th century up to the climate and debt crises of the present day. And it was actually my fascination in oil that led me to this project. There's a kind of line in the conclusion or the introduction about how the Caribbean is globally distinct because oil-fired generation is still the dominant form of creating electricity. And I never stopped to think about, why was that the case? Why was that the case? So it will be a regional history if I can be so ambitious, but I've currently done the most work on Suriname. Oil is not, certainly the age of oil is not over, even though these plants stand in some ways as industrial ruins because they have been, they're seeking new management and ownership since 2019. So there are still ongoing attempts to try to reopen them. And in fact, all of the refineries in the Caribbean, because these were the first plants in the region that were built to process foreign crude, but they usher in this incredible wave of enclave refinery construction throughout the region because of all these offshore legal entanglements. During COVID-19, when tourism came to a halt, there were all these renewed efforts to try to reopen the aging refineries in the Caribbean. And certainly we're watching what's happening in Guyana, in Suriname, and across the region as there's new oil exploration happening. So what lessons are there to draw from this? I mean, to me, I think that as a historian, am I going to stop climate change? No. I mean, I wish I could. But we have a role to play, however small, in thinking about the way that, as Mary said, oil is not just a commodity. It shapes our social values, our desires, our identities. And there is at least an imaginative aspect for us to imagine, like, what are the kinds of social relationships that we want to take into the world beyond oil? And studying the history of all of the categories of difference and inequities that are bound up in the fossil economy is, I think, an invitation that we can take forward. Like, what other world do we want to build differently as we look to, green technologies, which in so many ways are just fossil fuels plus, as Sandra Dunlap says. About the question on different impacts to different communities, yes, that is something that I look at, because the oil industry operates very much in Aruba and Curacao through creating different kinds of intimate regimes for different classes of workers, different categories of workers. So whereas local Aruban and Curaçaoan men were enticed to be domesticated and therefore depoliticized because you could not deport these workers if they demanded higher wages or if they went on strike, you had to sort of contend with them. The idea was to extend a certain form of like welfare capitalism to these workers. Houses, and HR would literally encourage workers who were living in common law marriages or unmarried but living with partners to marry, so that those who had mouths to feed and mortgages to pay would not be unruly, would not be demanding. But for British West Indian workers, for instance, they had to adhere to an entirely different sexual regime. They, along with workers from China, workers from Colombia and Venezuela, to a lesser extent, there was some family migration for Venezuelan workers because there are these longstanding ties between Venezuela and Aruba and Curacao. But many of these migrant workers were not encouraged to marry. If they had families, the families had to stay behind, and then wages would be sent abroad. And this was thought to be extremely profitable for oil companies because they could be responsive to any change in fluctuation in demand. If those workers went on strike, they would be deported, and that happened constantly. But the strategies of social reproduction change, and this comes back to a question that Mary raised about learning from the empire. So Shell is born in Indonesia, in the Dutch colony of Indonesia. And regularly you see them, Shell oilmen in Curacao, sort of learning from, okay, actually, the workers that we brought to the oil camps in Indonesia became much more docile when we allowed them to have their families. So they're learning across the empire, and these strategies of social reproduction change. To the question about research methods, thank you. I went to, in the bibliography it's there, 15 archives in Aruba, Curacao, the Netherlands, the United States. And I also did some oral history interviews, but this study is primarily archivally based. And I'm kind of committed to, in the vein of feminist Caribbean historiography, seeing what we can do with these archival documents, because so many of them are told from the perspective of white elites. Some of the images that you see in this talk, let me just go back to a few of them. Okay, I'll take the one on the left, for instance, the brothel. I love this. This was probably my favorite archival discovery. I found it in the family photo album of a US-American oil worker who went to Aruba to prepare the refinery grounds. It had no label apart from the name Hollywood. So I'm sure his wife wouldn't have known what she was looking at or its children when they saw this photo album years later. But of course, I knew what Hollywood was. And this image is so important to me because it brought visual proof to what I had been reading about, that these sites of intimacy were simultaneously the only sites in the refinery where lines of race and class blurred. You have white men, men of color, standing outside. After a shift, the line would extend beyond a city block. And I show you this because, there's a really interesting archive created by the white US Americans who lived in Aruba. It is the testament to the way that oil creates deep feelings of nostalgia and affective attachment to fossil fuels, that this community felt so tied to their experience, their good life on Aruba, that they created this archive. It tells the histories of white communities. However, in this archive, ubiquitous mentions of people of color that everywhere show the dependence of white elites on people of color in all aspects of daily life, from the production work to the domestic work, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as Caribbean scholars have long confronted, where we don't have voice, we have action in the archive. We have action. So when I have the diaries of white women complaining about how their domestic workers only prepared dinner but didn't set the table, I see someone trying to control the conditions of their labor, right? And so I wanted to see, again, in that vein of Caribbean feminist scholarship, how we could turn the limitations of the archive to show how Caribbean communities contested with the age of oil.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Did you want to? Yeah, may I ask a question? And it's actually still related to in some ways, to the sources and archives. Oh, no, please, go ahead. I have time. Go ahead. Yeah. It's, if you were to speak to a potential scholar who wants to do the kind of study that you've done in another context, what words of advice or caution would you give? Because I think one of the things that's so impressive about this study is, and I mentioned it in my comments, is how it comes at this. Oil is like the giant that's at the center of it, or the octopus. And then it has all these tentacles that go many different directions, but of course, all of those, the material that you need to be able to draw out and describe those tentacles isn't necessarily all located in the same archive. And so how do you go about designing a project like this and executing it? I hope that's not too big a question. But I think it's really interesting, and for those of us who think about how to make the studies of this be relevant and in multiple kinds of venues, and not just, not that that's not enough, simply, as histories of extractive industries, or as histories of sexuality, or as histories of migratory labor. How do you combine those, right? How do you go about doing that? Thank you. Please.
So, there's a lot going on, and I love this book. You know how much I appreciate this. Mary mentioned the legal places and legal structures being reconfigured. And there's a constant tension in the book, the us versus them, that is in every possible realm. The family, the social dynamics, the economic dynamics, the legal dynamics, it's there all the time. It's not only a book about what is going on there, but I think you do it in such a beautiful way. You know how much I appreciate your writing too. It's so beautifully written that sometimes it feels like the tension is there throughout the book, but it doesn't feel as us versus them as in other experiments. And I think of Portlandia as a good example of that, when there's this invasion, basically, and settlement in the middle of the Amazon, and just the feeling that this is how it's going to operate. We're going to play polka and waltz, and that's going to be the official music. There's no prostitution here. There's no alcohol consumption. This is the morality of what Ford companies do, and that's what Ford does, and this is how it's going to be. And you see it collapsing, not only because of course, the lack of interest on local knowledge that was crucial for the production of rubber in the Amazon, but also for the lack of understanding of local dynamics and desires even. Like, he left. But he said something like, understanding the necessity, they allowed women to arrive. Right. And you said they were more docile with family around. And we know how much authoritarian institutions appreciate the institution of family as a way of controlling everything. So I was just wanting to hear more from you about that level of to what extent is it morality, and to what extent is it business? And just keeping them happy and settled, and that's it. And also, to what extent is this a negotiation in which they are creating something new, or this is an imposition and an us versus them dynamics that, I know those are almost impossible questions to answer, but I just wanted to hear your take, because I think this is all over the book. And just to end, you mentioned the exhibition about the Amazon. There's a very good one on the 3rd floor of that modern art museum right behind the Museu Botero, Claudia Andujar, the Brazilian photographer, on the Amazon and the Yanomamis. That is, you can't miss. It's amazing. If you didn't see it in New York, it's a good opportunity. Thank you.
I wish we'd had this on day one of the conference so I could go back to all these exhibits. Mary, your question about advice that I would give to scholars working on projects. And I think the best advice I could give is not super prescriptive, but this book is really the result of failure in so many ways, like of not finding what I thought I would find. I went in wanting to tell the story of metropole and colony and feeling like, well, this doesn't work, and yet trying to fit that square peg into a round hole. And I think really listening to the emotional content, the transnational content of the sources when they defied my expectations, is of course what we're taught to do as historians, but nevertheless some of us are stubborn. So I would say really following that messiness and embracing the messiness. And when I had a manuscript workshop, the historian Laura Putnam participated, and she saw an early version of this really messy monograph. And she said, embrace the messiness as part of the intervention. So that clarified things for me. I thought that offshore could actually be the way that I signal this story moves, because the frames that we have typically employed to study the international are themselves messy. Mm-hmm. And so to take the thing that I thought wasn't working and make it an intervention helped me a lot. So, Mila, thank you for your question. And thank you for this observation that the story doesn't read as an us versus them account. And to me, that is actually so important, because that was my goal. The goal was to show how these categories of difference are constantly historically constructed and changing. And also politically and intellectually, I'm really concerned to identify how even elites in this history are constantly failed by the privileges that they gain. Because to the question about what do we take from this, I think it's also worth reckoning with how the age of oil has created so many disappointments, even for the communities that are most privileged by them. So in the diaries of white US women in Aruba, for instance, we see constantly their sense of alienation, their sense of loneliness, their sense of deep disappointment, and the sense of hypocrisy that they lived with, that they were compelled to project this image of matrimonial harmony when actually they're mad at their husbands and their lives are not fun, right? To me, that was important to point out, not to say, oh, they suffered and how bad, but to say, we should all be invested from our different positionalities in seeing the ends of these systems that are killing us all, albeit unevenly, right? And to your question about to what extent is this a story of morality, to what extent is it a story of business, obviously it's both, but I think it's worth returning to Mary's insight about really denaturalizing. For instance, scholarship on mineral frontiers or Fordlandia. There's often this assumption that wherever there are industries full of men, there will be sex work. But actually, it took an enormous amount of energy that actually made no sense. I mean, you have KLM, the Dutch airline, trying to fly sex workers constantly from Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic to Aruba. In so many ways, this system was not natural, right? And we tend to naturalize capitalist processes as making a lot of sense, but they didn't. They were completely nonsensical, and costly, right? So to what extent is it business? To what extent is it morality? I mean, I would say that there's no categorical distinction, perhaps, between the two of those. So I hope that answers your question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chelsea. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. I think we're closing the mesa.
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's fantastic. It is. It is.